Hi everyone, so this is a replacement video for our class about LDAP. Things just didn't go very well. We ran into some issues configuring PHP LDAP admin, ran into some issues actually configuring the LDAP client, and hopefully I'll spend some time in this video talking about how we can get around those errors and what exactly I did wrong, so hopefully when you're configuring LDAP authentication you can do it correctly. So the first thing that I recommend is actually purging everything from your system. If you have an existing Apache install, PHP installs, run this command, purging all the packages that contain any of these terms. So that's what the stars around those. It would match anything that contains those terms. So I'll just run that really quick here. And I actually have already run that command, so we wouldn't see any output. So the first thing that we need to do after we have our system established is install our LDAP server. You can see that. You need to type in a password. But by default, LDAP is going to use example.com as our domain name, and that's probably not what we want to do in a normal place. Now we're going to change it to test.com, which is just as convoluted, but it's just kind of an example of how you would actually go about changing your domain. So what we'll have to do is do dpackage reconfigure /d, and that will open up this configuration UI again. At this time it'll be a little bit more advanced. So what we want to do is select, we're just going to take the defaults for most of this, except for our DNS domain. So we'll say test.com. What that will hopefully result in is dc equals test and then dc equals com, and that will be our base. And then we'll just leave this as no domain right here. We have to re-enter our password. And then we'll accept the defaults for the rest of it. And I'll just say I do want to remove the database when it's purged. Accept the defaults. When we go to look at our netstat output, we should see listening on port 389/D. So I think we have our LDAP server functioning. So the next thing we need to do is install Apache, if we don't have it installed yet. And we'll also install PHP LDAP admin. So PHP LDAP admin is installing PHP. It's installing the PHP LDAP modules it needs. It's installing the actual source code of that program, and it's enabling it in Apache. So I think what we're going to see here is an error, if I recall correctly, and this is the error that we encountered in class, and we're going to try and work around that error. Actually, it's resolving it itself right here, so that's good to see. We're going to come back to that in a second. So there's two different ways that there's a couple different ways, I guess, that Apache can be run. One of them is kind of event-driven, and one of them is forking. And it's not really worth getting into, but if you see something like your module was compiled with threaded support, but PHP isn't in threaded mode, basically there's two commands here that you can run to get around that. You need to disable the event module and enable the pre-fork module. So you say a2 dismod, or this command right here, and then you say this command right here to enable forking instead. And you can see, I don't know what triggered this and why it was different on this install, but it actually was resolved here, I think, and automatically switched to pre-fork. If we look at our netstat status, Apache is currently listening, so I think everything is good to go. So again, run those commands if Apache isn't successfully starting. So let's go ahead and navigate over to our server. 253.54 PHP LDAP admin. And there we go. Actually, never mind. There's one final thing that we have to do before we actually navigate over there. What we need to do is configure a couple parameters inside our PHP LDAP admin configuration. PHP LDAP admin config.php. So we need to navigate down to this define your LDAP servers in this section. Most of the things are alright. We see we have our name here. We're just going to leave that as is. We're going to connect to localhost, but take note that we did change our domain name, so we'll need to change that from example to test.com. And I think we will also need to change this admin from this path here, this domain component. That used to be example, now it's test. And let's also go ahead and change the password for the admin user to password exclamation point. And that's just saying that PHP LDAP admin by default is going to log in with the admin user. Alright, so let's go back over here. Now when we refresh this page, we should see this example changing to test, hopefully. Yep, so now we have that domain component updated correctly, and we'll log in with the password that we set at the command line. Cool, so we're logged into our server, and we have our default configuration. So there's a number of ways that we could set this up. Normally you might have organizational units that refer to the actual units in your organization, such as accounting, sales, engineering perhaps. For now, we're just going to actually create two organizational units just to kind of act as folders, for lack of a better term. We're going to create one that's users. We're going to create one that's groups. Once we have that created, we're going to make some groups to go for our groups. We're going to create two groups, one group that will contain standard users and one group that will contain privileged users, administrators. So one thing that I noted in class is you need to check out your GID numbers. So these are your group ID numbers, and make sure that they're not colliding with the existing group numbers on your system. So in order to do that, we'd look at etc group, and we would check out our group ID numbers. And that's this number right here. So look through that, make sure there's no collisions there. We see we do have one that's at 1,000, so that might get a little bit close, but there's nothing inside of around 500. So we should be perfectly clear to actually take that GID of 500 for the user group users. Commit that out. We'll go ahead. Shoot, I actually didn't make that in the right location. See if I can. Let me move that. I should have made it under groups. I should have clicked on groups and clicked create child entry here. But what I'll do is I'll click on users, and I'll hopefully move that to. I'll just hit the browse button. I'll move that to this OU groups. So you have the OU there, and we'll delete after copy. So that again is something that I shouldn't have had to do. If I would have just done it right the first time, this is what would have happened. Yeah, for some reason that group is still there, so I'll just go in and manually delete that. Refresh. Okay. So this is okay. So this is how we would have actually made a real group. The correct way the first time, we would have clicked on the OU that we wanted it to be created in. Then we would create child entry, group, admins. And there we go. Now we can see it was actually created under that OU. So let's go and make some users. Let's say We want to create a user account. I will say my name is test standard. Okay. And this will be our user that's just a user but is not an administrator. We'll just put that in their first name and last name box. Might have to tweak that a little bit, and then we'll put them in the users group. Login shelf right now is going to be bensh. We will say password 1 exclamation point. We'll use crypt. So crypt is the default encryption for Unix systems. Never mind. And then I messed a few things up. Okay, so we're just going to say test dash standard for everything and create. So the one thing I also didn't know was this UID number. Again, just like their groups, we need to check and make sure there's no collisions there. So I'll go over here, I'll cat @c password, and we can see we actually have DSU with a user ID of 1000 already. So we're going to have to go in and we're going to have to manually change that. I'll change it to 2000. There's nothing right there right now. And the other thing that I want to do is change their shell from bin sh to bin bash. Just bin bash is just slightly more feature heavy. You know, it's just something we would normally want our users to use bash instead of sh. Okay, so we have one user created. So let's go ahead. What I'm going to do is copy this, if I can find that button. Yes, I will take my one user and I'll copy it, so just so I don't have to refill in all those blanks. I'll say test admin is their new user instead. Bash, and I'll say 2001. And actually, I want to put this in group 501, which is our admins group. We could have created this from scratch, and I actually need to change this too. I probably should have just created it from scratch. Copying it was kind of a waste of time, because I have to go through and change all of these anyway. Cool. So we have one group test admin, which is in groups admin, has all the details that would be for that user, and one group that, or one user that is for standard testing. Cool. So I think that's all we need to do for configuring our server. Let's go ahead and try and configure a client. So here we are on Ubuntu 2. What we have to do is we have this libpam LDAP package that we install, which actually allows us to connect to LDAP when we're logging in. We have to configure NSSwitch to actually query LDAP for our users and our groups. And then we also have this pam auth update command, which we can use to configure home directory creation. So normally, if we were to just do the pam module and the NSSwitch, that would not create home directories for our users when they were logging in. So normally one of the things that we would do when you're creating users is we'd say user add -m, and we're creating the directory as the administrator when we're creating that user. But we can actually instruct PAM to create directories for users that do not have them. So that's one of the things we'll do. So we need to install that PAM module, libpam LDAP, accept that. So this is the one error that I made. So the LDAP API is only for Unix sockets, that's for localhost. So what you need to do is you have to make sure that you shorten that path to just LDAP. So not LDAP API, just LDAP. And then we'll point it over to our server that's hosting our LDAP database, which is 253.54. We need to change these components to be the correct one. So we said test.com. We're going to use LDAP version 3. We want to make the local root a database admin, so when users use the password command to change their password, it will actually change their password on all hosts. The LDAP database doesn't require login to actually test if a user is part of it or is in the database or their credentials are valid. Anybody on the network at this point can just connect to the database and query it arbitrarily. So perhaps in a more secure environment, you might have a user that is dedicated to just connecting to the database, but in this case, anybody can, so we're just going to select no here. So this is our admin account, so cn admin domain component test dc com. Alright, so that's up and running here. So the second thing we'll have to do is configure NS switch. So this specifies where our password group shadow and a bunch of other files on our system are actually coming from. So when a programmer is calling something like get users from a C library, they're actually seeing a combination of different files that may be returned to them. So when we say files, that means the actual etc gshadow file on our disk. So compat, there's mostly files, but there's also a few other places that could be on the system. But for other things, there might be a database. In our case, what we want to do is we want to query LDAP for our password, for our group, and for our shadow. And what that will do is it will try and connect to LDAP, and it will retrieve any results from LDAP first, and then it will look at our local files second. So after we've configured that, I think we're pretty much good to go. The final thing that we want to do is run pam auth update. We can see we have this new box that's here. It's LDAP authentication. That's already all enabled. But the thing that we do want to enable is creating a home directory on a login. So we'll select that box right there and select OK. Now when I log out, if everything's gone correctly, what will happen is I can say test standard. And of course, things aren't working quite as intended. I'm going to go look at my auth log really quick here. Invalid DN syntax. Okay, so I must have messed up a little bit when I was configuring my users. So I'm just going to run dpackage reconfigure really quick here on LDAP auth config. That looks good. DC test com, yep. 3, yep, no. Oh, okay, CN. Yep, so I needed to use CN. I instead mistyped and put CD there. Obviously incorrect. Entering the empty password will reuse the old one. We want to use crypt actually. So we didn't change this before, so it would have failed regardless. And I'm kind of unsure about why we weren't presented with this dialog the first time around. But we'll select crypt now, and hopefully things will work out. So I've had some problems in the past actually getting this to work, refreshing the LDAP config or the LDAP connection, but I think it's gonna work out this time. We're just gonna hope for the best. So I'll switch user to what did we have? Test standard. And there we go. So everything worked out correctly. So we had to say the CN right. We had to change the crypto option to crypt, and now we can see we logged in as that standard user. If we check out our ID, we have GID of 500 as expected. We're in the users group, and we have a new home directory created. So we saw we had that home directory created. So everything looks good. And if we were to add additional servers, hosts to this LDAP configuration, they'd all pull that authentication information from our server. And if we were to type password, we would see something a little bit different than normal. So we'd see this enter login LDAP password. So normally we would see enter login Unix password. So as an LDAP user, we can actually change our LDAP password, and this will change across all of our different devices right here by using the password command. That's why we needed to configure an administrative user on our clients that could connect to the LDAP server. So I'll say my old password. Something's wrong with the administrator binding, but that doesn't really matter right now. We're going to leave that as is. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to do is look at that admins group. So if I was to log in as that test admin, and we were looking at ID, we'd see that their GID is actually admins. So, thinking of the knowledge that we have right now, we could actually go over to our sudoers file and see we have this members of the admin group may gain root privileges. So I forget, we might actually have messed up a little bit here and have an existing admin group. No, we don't. Okay, cool. Great. So there was no existing admin group by default, and since that new user that we created is part of that admin group, what we should see is we should be able to switch to root. Not quite. Admins. I think there's an admin group, and that's what's actually in the sudoers. Yes, there's an existing admin group. You'd want to change that to admins, as I had configured it in LDAP. Or you could have just gone back into LDAP. Instead of saying the group's name is admins, you could have changed it to admin to match that file. I'm going to log it all the way just to make sure that everything's working. Then I'll switch over to test admin. Now we can see that it's in the sudoers file as being allowed to run sudo commands, and since it's in the admins group, we can successfully switch to root. Alright, so there we have it. That's how you would go about setting up LDAP. Some things that we want to think about moving forward is right now this connection is unencrypted. So I believe what's happening is when you type your password in, it's actually encrypting it and sending the encrypted password to the LDAP server, or sorry, the hashed password, slightly different, the hashed password to the server. But as an attacker, you could capture that hashed password and just replay it to authenticate as a user. One thing that you might want to do is turn on LDAP encryption, so actually using TLS to encrypt your LDAP sessions, something you'll probably end up doing in a larger environment. But for this test demo environment, it's not really that big of a challenge. We're just more looking at how you would go about setting up LDAP. Alright, so that's all I have for this video. Hopefully this was a better explanation of what was going on and we kind of bypassed some of those errors. Remember to reset your VMs to scratch, I guess. So purging all of those packages that I talked about at the beginning. If you're having Apache errors, you need to disable the event module and enable the pre-fork module instead. And then if things aren't working for LDAP, make sure you're looking at the auth log. So all of the LDAP client errors, at least, would go to the auth log, and then running dpackage reconfigure that libpam.ldap-ldap, or sorry, we need to run dpackage reconfigure ldap auth config. So we're not reconfiguring libpam.-ldap, it's ldap auth config. So I messed that up a little bit earlier. It worked in my search history because I just controlled R. It was like, well, I want to do the last dpackage reconfigure, but I didn't have it right on the notepad document. So yeah, that's all I have for you. Good luck.